Hi students, I switched to OneNote because I was having so many technical difficulties in PowerPoint, so hopefully this will go a lot better. What we're focused on now for section 6.6 is combining graph transformations with a lot of different options for the different things that are acting on the trig functions. So what we're going to do is we're going to break each part down, and then I'm going to show you the process that I use for graphing. So the first thing to notice is that we have a change in the amplitude. The amplitude is going to be 2 in this case. And then we also have a phase shift. This is going to move the graph to the right by pi over 3. Another thing to take note of is that anything that acts on the outside of the parentheses is going to have an effect of moving up, down. So the amplitude is going to affect the y values. And then anything that's inside the parentheses is going to move us left, right, which are the x values. And so this phase shift is going to be affecting the x values. So that'll make a difference when we're making our chart of what the values are that we want to consider. So the way that I do this is sort of in a systematic fashion. I start by thinking about what the period of this graph is. We don't have a value for b, so the period of this will be unchanged. The period of this graph is going to be 2 times pi. And so then when I go to make my chart, I'll start with 0 and I'll go up to 2 pi and then split the whole period into 4 sections. So these are going to end up being the normal breaks that we see. But then this is where I'm going to take that phase shift into account, and I'm going to add pi over 3 to each of these values. Now notice that in the original it's a minus pi over 3, but remember that when we're inside the parentheses, it has the opposite effect of what we would think, so it's shifting to the right. So for my math values, I'm going to be adding. I'm going to add those values. So I'm going to end up with pi over 3 here. Use a calculator to add all of these fractions together. This will be 5 pi over 6. This is 4 pi over 3. This is 11 pi over 6. And then 7 pi over 3. If you're doing this by hand, you have to change everything to have a common denominator. I think it's easier just to use a calculator in this particular case. So these are the x values that we're going to end up graphing right here. And then we'll continue this same process to look at our y values. For our y values, because we're looking at cosine, normally we go from the maximum point as our starting value to the center or the midpoint, up to down to the min, middle again, and then back to the max. And those values are 1 for the maximums, -1 for the minimum, and 0s at the midline. But now what we'll do is we'll take that amplitude change into account, and we'll take each of these values and we're going to multiply by 2. So each of those values will change to 2, -2, and 2. Notice that the only thing that changed are the max and the min points. All of the midline points stay in the same location. So the points I'm going to be graphing are pi over 3, 2. This is 5 pi over 6, 0, 4 pi over 3, -2, 11 pi over 6, 0, and 7 pi over 3, 2. So I think when I make my graph, I'm going to have this count up by sixths, because that's the common denominator between all of these. So pi over 3 is the same as 2 pi over 6, right? And 4 pi over 3 is the same as 8 pi over 6. 7 pi over 3 is 14 pi over 6. I'll just use those as my values. So this will be, my first tick mark is going to be here, 2/6, 3, 4, 5/6, and then I have 8/6, 6, 7, 8/6, 11, and then 14 here. So those are my values. I'll mark them. This is 7, maybe I should mark it below, 7 pi over 3. Back here we have pi over 3, and everything in between. My max value, I'm going to stretch this out, my max value is going to be up at 2, so I'll put a tick mark here for 2, and then my lower bound will be at -2, so I'll put a mark here. And then I'm going to draw my graph. So starting at pi over 3, we're starting at the maximum value because this is a cosine graph, going to the midline, down to a minimum, midline, and then back up to the max. So here's our graph. It's going to look like this. And that'll give us one period of the graph. So let's look at a second example. This is one that has a sine graph. We know that we need to rewrite this so that we can factor out that 2 that's in the front. And that gets factored out of both the 2x, and also we divide the pi by 2. So we're going to have the amplitude of this graph is going to be 4. The period is going to shift to be 2 pi over 2, or pi. And then we're going to shift to the right by pi over 2. Okay. So let's start with our x values. The period is going to go from 0 to pi. We'll have pi over 2 in the middle. Pi over 4 is the quarter point, and then 3 pi over 4 as the other quarter point. Then we'll look at the phase shift, which is going to move all of the values to the right by pi over 2, so we'll add pi over 2 to all of those values. And we're going to end up with pi over 2. We'll have a 3 pi over 4. This will be pi. 5 pi over 4. And then 3 pi over 2. So those are the x values that we're going to be graphing. And then we'll look at the y values. For the y values, for sine, normally we start at the midline, go up to the max, back to the midline, down to the minimum, and then back to the midline. Those values are usually 0, 1, -1, 0, 0, -1, and then 0. But we have the amplitude to consider. So we will multiply each of those values by 4. So this will, all of the zeros stay at 0. The 1 will shift to a 4, and the -1 changes to a -4. So these are the y values that we're going to be plotting. So we have pi over 2, 0, 3 pi over 4, 4, pi 0, (5 pi over 4, -4, and 3 pi over 2, 0. Right, so let's put these together on our graph. So I think I'm going to go by fourths for this graph. So I'll have 1/4 pi over 2. Actually, I think I need to spread that out because those are too close together. Let's go 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. So this is pi over 2. 4/4, which is pi. 5, 6, 7, 8. We need to go to 3 pi over 2 is the same as 6 pi over 4, right? So we need to go here. This is 3 pi over 2. Our max value is going to be at 4, which is here. And our min is going to be at -4, which is here. And then I'll plot my points. So I'm starting at 0, going up to the max, back to the middle, down to the min, and then back to the middle. So my graph is going to look like this. Well, let's see how much time I have left on this video.